The economic fallout from the pandemic spreading shockwaves throughout local budgets, whether in Boston or in gateway cities such as Everett, Brockton, and Lawrence. Officials can learn from what happened during the Great Recession, but the current downturn is more severe, if also possibly more temporary. To tell us about some preliminary lessons in a report for the Pioneer Institute is the author and a Peters Fellow, Andrew Mikula. Thank you very much for being with us, Andrew.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
And I want to start with a comparison to 2008, since a lot of us are still remembering that right now, maybe even still feeling some pain from it. How is what we're going through right now similar to what happened back in the Great Recession?
That's a good question. I think, obviously the recession originated in the housing market in 2008. So that we saw a lot of foreclosures. We saw a lot of people struggling to pay property taxes. I think that'll be the case this time as well. I think, when you have unemployment rates, 15% nationally right now, it's hard for a lot of these cash-strapped families to be able to pay property taxes at the local level, from which a lot of communities get most of their revenue in Massachusetts. But then there's the matter of, commercial property taxes are also going to be hit hard because, a lot of businesses on Main Street aren't open.
Now, one thing you noticed in your report, and I noticed this back, 10 to 12 years ago when I was looking at real estate data and property tax data, is that there's a lag. On the way up, our tax assessors didn't really keep track of the bubble and all the froth in the bubble, and they were kind of slow to pick up on the downturn too. So what does that mean for revenue?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that lag is for a few reasons. First of all, when the assessor actually makes the assessment, it doesn't show up on your tax receipts until at least the next year. And oftentimes changes in assessed value for real estate are, phased in over a couple of years. And in some communities, it might not even be every year that you get an assessment on a given property. So when you have that sort of lag, you might not see the property tax, the property values start to reflect the economic reality until a couple of years out. It only really showed up in the Great Recession in Massachusetts on the property tax, the growth rate in property tax collections, or assessed values a couple of years after it was quite clear we were in a recession.
Well, one thing is definitely different, even though this has been only about the past 2 months. We have a lot more people out of work, a lot more tenants are unable to pay the rent, a lot more landlords are unable to pay the mortgage. So isn't that going to add up too?
Absolutely. I think the Eviction Moratorium passed by the legislature a couple of weeks ago is an important first step. But a lot of landlords have mortgages to pay too. And I think there's good cause for further delays in that process for property owners as well. But oftentimes it feels like it's just kicking the can down the road. And if governments can't collect, payments, if banks can't collect payments, eventually the concern is you're going to see abandoned properties in places like Lawrence, where it was a big problem in the 90s again.
I guess another thing to look at here is the reliance on the state for filling these holes in the budget. Because in Boston, we have a diverse tax base. We have a lot of commercial property, and we have institutional payments in lieu of taxes. But you're talking about a place like Everett and Lawrence. What about the state being able to fill the void there?
Yeah, I think at the state level, in a way, it's even harder because a lot of the local aid actually comes from sources, revenue sources that are very volatile. You talk about 80 something percent of the revenue from tax revenue from Plainridge Park Casino goes to local aid. Cities like, Chelsea and Brockton that have hard time using property taxes or other taxes on the local level to pay for their schools and their roads and their employees. But at the state level, I mean, Plainridge Park isn't open. The sales taxes and income taxes at the state level are plummeting. And so it's going to be hard to direct that revenue to these places like Everett and Brockton you mentioned. During the Great Recession between 2008 and 2010, local aid declined by 30% in Massachusetts, and it hasn't really ever recovered. So this seems like a similar hit that some of these local government coffers are going to take.
Well, you mentioned things like casino revenue, but you have a huge amount of income tax revenue that's probably going to take a hit. Capital gains is certainly going to take a hit. I guess what this sort of leads me to, do the states have to turn to Washington? This is not just about Massachusetts. And isn't there a federal role to step in here even more robustly to help these states?
I think ultimately the feds have much more leverage to provide fill some of those gaps in the short term. Both state and local governments in Massachusetts have a mandate where they can't really carry over a deficit into the next fiscal year. We've delayed property taxes a bit until June 1st in Massachusetts for some cities, but I mean it's budget season right now. The legislature's already rewritten, their budget for fiscal year 2021, and I think that the feds are going to have to fill in those gaps. But as we saw in the Great Recession, the state could also consider raising taxes. They raised the sales tax rate from 5% to 6.25% in 2009 to help make up for lost revenue. I think they might do something again. I just wish they didn't double down on the volatile sources of revenue, like the sales tax, like the income tax, that are going to be hit so hard because when the next recession hits, sales tax revenue only plummets again.
What about the kind of things that have to be cut during these periods of austerity? During the Great Recession, local budgets, that meant maybe you cut back on cultural programs and maybe some work on streets and sidewalks. But given what's happening now, isn't it going to have to be different in some way?
Well, I think with the kind of the virtual world of education that we're seeing right now, a lot of local budgets, most of their expenditure is in education, local schools. And it's a bit of a different equation when all the learning is online right now. I think the custodians, the cafeteria workers, the bus drivers are going to have to take a hit. And there's certainly a state and federal role to play in filling those gaps. But if your job is tied to the facilities of education, the facilities maintained by cities and towns, then that's it's going to be hard to find a role for you when these budget cuts become inevitable.